All right. June Radley said it in a voice that didn't shake, though her hands were pressed flat against her thighs to hide the trembling. Across the kitchen table sat Aaron Tate, the most quietly feared man between Fort Macleod and the Oldman River, watching her with a stillness she couldn't measure. Her father Harold had gone the color of old flour. Her mother Ellen had both arms crossed over her chest so tight she looked like she was holding herself together by force alone. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside, the Alberta wind moved through the fence posts with its particular low sound, the one that came in autumn when the prairies started remembering what winter cost. She was 24 years old. She had first heard Aaron Tate's name 11 days ago. She had no particular feeling about him, because there was nothing particular to feel about a man she'd never met. Only rumors she'd been collecting and sorting the way you sort old grain, keeping what seemed true and discarding the rest. What she knew, he owned the largest cattle operation in the Foothills district. He employed more men than any other rancher in the territory. He had been seen in town twice in the past year, and both times people had stepped slightly to the side without quite knowing why. He was 36 years old and had never been married. He kept to himself in the particular way of someone who had decided at some point, and for some reason, that this was the wiser choice. What she didn't know, everything else. And now Harold Radley, her father, a careful man, a quiet man, a man who had farmed this quarter section since before June could walk, was not looking at her. He was studying his hands on the table. He'll clear all of it, Harold had told her that morning, before Tate arrived. The feed loans, the bank mortgage, the line of credit from the Hendersons that had been gathering interest through 2 dry summers and 1 flooded one. All of it. In exchange for, June had said. When her father didn't answer right away, she already knew. She had not cried. She had gone to the window and stood there for a long time watching the horses in the near field. Then she had turned around and said, "What time is he coming?" Tate arrived at 4 o'clock with his hat in his hands before he'd fully crossed the threshold, which Harold noticed, and which June noticed Harold noticing. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way of a man who worked rather than worried, and he had the kind of quiet about him that didn't come from shyness. It came from somewhere deeper, like a man who had already thought through most of what was going to happen, and had made his peace with it. He looked at her like a person he didn't yet know and intended to read carefully. Her parents left the room with an awkwardness that made June's jaw tighten. She and Aaron Tate sat across from each other at the kitchen table where she had eaten every birthday supper of her life, and she looked at him and waited. "I don't need you to like this," he said. She hadn't expected that. "I imagine you've been told the situation clearly," he continued. "What I want to say is that you have a choice. You can refuse. I'll walk out that door and I won't hold it against your family. This only works if it's something you agree to freely." "And if I agree," June said, keeping her voice level the way she'd practiced, "what exactly does that mean?" He told her. Tate Ranch needed someone to run the household side of the operation, the accounts, the coordination with the families of the ranch hands, the supply ordering, the 10,000 practical things that kept a large working property from falling into disorder. His housekeeper had left the previous spring to follow her daughter to Winnipeg. Things had been difficult since. "This is a business arrangement," he said. "That's the honest truth of it." "And the rest of it," June said. He understood. Something in his expression shifted. Not discomfort, but care. "That's not what I'm asking for. You'd have your own room, your own space. Whatever this becomes, it becomes slowly. Or it doesn't become anything at all." He paused. "You wouldn't be trapped." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why me specifically?" He was quiet. Then, "Your father is an honest man. The way he spoke about you, the way this conversation clearly cost him, says something about the family he raised. I'd rather know the people are decent than know the land is good." A pause. "And I heard you kept the Radley farm running through both bad seasons, mostly on your own." June looked down at her hands. She thought about her brothers. Owen was 19. Thomas was 14. She thought about her mother's hands, already older than her years. She thought about her father's posture, the way it had curved slowly forward over the past 3 seasons, like a man carrying something too heavy to ever fully set down. "If I come to that ranch," she said, "and I discover anything you've told me was a lie, I won't stay quiet about it. I'll make sure everyone in this district knows exactly what kind of man you are." He looked at her then, and something moved in his face that she hadn't seen yet. Something that looked, almost, like recognition. "Good," he said. "Hold on to that." She told her family yes that evening. Quietly, the way you say a thing when the decision is already made and what's left is simply moving forward. Harold closed his eyes. Ellen held her too long and too hard. Owen and Thomas didn't entirely understand, which was perhaps a mercy. That night, June allowed herself exactly 1 hour of feeling everything she was feeling, the fear. The grief for the life she'd been building in her imagination, quietly, the way women in her situation built things. In the margins, in the spaces no one was watching. The anger, clean and hot, that 2 hard seasons and a world with very few doors open to women had brought her here. Then she lit the lamp, got out her notebook, and started a list of what she'd need to bring with her. She was not going to Tate Ranch as a victim. She was going as a woman who'd made a clear decision with her eyes open, and she would manage whatever came next the same way she'd managed every hard thing before it. She mostly believed that. The wedding was a small thing. A minister passing through from Lethbridge, the ceremony in the Radley front room, only family present. June wore her mother's ivory dress, altered to fit through the waist. Aaron wore a clean shirt and his least worn coat. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man taking a serious matter seriously, which was, she supposed, the best she could have hoped for. When the minister asked if she consented of her own free will, June paused for 1 full second, long enough for Ellen to draw a quiet breath, and then said, "I do." Aaron's ring was plain silver, it fit. After the brief celebration, tea, her mother's shortbread, several conversations that didn't quite land, Aaron brought the wagon around. June carried her own trunk to the door before anyone could offer. She kissed her mother, she hugged her brothers. She shook Harold's hand because a hug would have made her cry, and she had decided she was finished crying. "Call for us if you need anything," Harold said, gripping her hand. "I'll be all right, Papa." "I know you will." He said it with such certainty and such guilt underneath it that June had to look away. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Aaron Tate, her husband, and kept her eyes on the road ahead. He flicked the reins. The horses moved, neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Aaron said, without looking at her, "Mrs. McIntyre from the next property came to put clean linens on your room. There's food in the larder." "Thank you," June said. Another half-mile of silence. "The hands know you're coming," he added. "I told them you're the mistress of the house. Anyone who doesn't treat you with respect doesn't have a job the following morning." June looked at the side of his face. "You said that to them?" "Said it plainly." She turned back to the road. "All right," she said quietly. The wagon rolled on under a wide Alberta sky, carrying June Radley, June Tate now, though the name still felt borrowed, toward a life she hadn't chosen, tended by a man she didn't know. She was frightened. She was angry. She had absolutely no idea what came next. But she had her list. She had her 2 hands, and her clear eyes and 24 years of learning that hard things don't wait for you to feel ready. She wasn't sure she would be all right, but she was sure she would not break. For now, that was enough to move forward on. The first morning at Tate Ranch, June lay still in the unfamiliar room and listened. She heard work. Not people starting their day, people already deep into one. Voices in the yard, low and purposeful, horses moving, the clang of the forge somewhere beyond the barn. Coffee that had been on long enough to get serious. She got up. She washed her face from the basin, dressed in her plainest cotton dress, braided her hair back tight, and walked into the main house. Aaron was already gone. There was a cup on the table and a note beside it, written in a hand that was careful and economical, like a man who had learned writing as a practical matter and never developed any particular affection for the craft. "Coffee's on the stove. Hands eat at 6, noon, and 6. Make a list of what you need for the kitchen and I'll send someone to town. A.T." June read it twice. Then she poured herself coffee, found the larder, adequately stocked but organized in a way that made no sense, and spent 20 minutes rearranging it entirely. Then she made breakfast. Not just for herself. She made enough for 10 people, because she'd counted that many men in the yard from the window. She was the mistress of this house. That meant something, whether anyone had asked her to prove it or not. When she carried the pan to the bunkhouse and knocked, there was a long pause from inside. Then a man of about 60, with a beard like weathered spruce, opened the door and looked at her. "Breakfast," June said. "Come get it while it's warm." His name was Bert Hackett. He was the foreman, a man who had worked for Aaron Tate for 9 years, and he looked at June with an expression she couldn't fully read, not unfriendly but watchful, like a man waiting to see which category she fit into before he committed to an opinion. The other hands were younger. Most of them were polite in the slightly stiff way of men who'd been told to be polite, and were actively remembering the instruction. One of them, a boy barely old enough to shave named Will Decker, thanked her twice, and then went red about it. None of them mentioned Aaron. She didn't ask. She didn't see him until dinner. She'd spent the day learning the house, larger than she'd expected, not as rough as she'd feared, but clearly managed by someone who thought of it as a shelter rather than a home. No curtains on most windows. The dining table had a crack down the center that had been left alone for too long. The kitchen had good equipment stored badly, as though whoever last organized it had done so in a hurry and never come back to finish. June noted everything. She cleaned what needed cleaning, found linens in a chest, and made the main room less bare. She was not decorating. She was making the place functional, which was different. She had dinner ready at 6. Aaron came in through the back door at exactly the hour, which told her he was a man who kept to a schedule. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the table properly set. Plates, not just a pot left on the stove, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name. "You didn't have to cook for me," he said. "You have to eat," June said. "So do I. It doesn't make sense to cook twice." He sat. She sat across from him. They ate the first meal of their marriage in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. The silence of two people being careful with each other, which was at least honest. "Halfway through," he said, "Hackett told me you brought the hands breakfast." "I made enough. Seemed wasteful not to." He looked up from his plate. "That's above what I asked of you." "I know." She met his eyes. "I don't do things by halves, Mr. Tate. If I'm managing this household, I'm managing it properly." He held her gaze for a moment. "Aaron," he said, "Mr. Tate was my father." She looked at him across the table. This quiet man who had turned her life sideways with an offer of money and a plain silver ring, and said, "All right, Aaron." Neither of them spoke again during the meal, but when he stood to take his plate to the counter, he carried hers as well. She noticed that. The days settled into a shape that was, if not comfortable, at least navigable. June learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by paying close attention and asking precise questions when necessary, rather than waiting for someone to explain things she could figure out on her own. She learned which hands had wives and children on the outer parcels of the property. She learned that two of those wives, a woman named Frances and another named Bet McLeod, had been largely isolated since the housekeeper left because nobody had thought to maintain the connection. June started visiting them. Frances's youngest had a persistent cough she recognized from her own childhood. She knew enough simple remedies from her mother to help. Bet was lonely in the specific way of a woman whose husband worked before dawn and after dark, and who had no one to talk to. June had conversation to give, and she gave it freely. Word came back to Aaron through Bert. It always seemed to come back through Bert, that the ranch wives were calling the new Mrs. Tate the best thing to happen to the property in years. Aaron said nothing about this to June directly, but one evening he came in from the north pasture and set a bolt of green wool on the kitchen table without comment. "What's this?" she asked. "For the windows," he said, and walked through to the back room. June stood looking at the fabric for a moment. It was good quality, better than she would have bought for herself. She picked it up and ran her thumb along the weave. She didn't say thank you that night. But the next morning she made his coffee the way she'd observed he preferred it, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and had it ready when he came in from the first round of chores. He noticed, she could tell. What she hadn't expected, what nobody could have warned her about, because it was the kind of thing you only learned by being in the middle of it, was how difficult it would be to remain wary of a man who kept proving himself not worth wariness. The matter of Will Decker made the first crack. Will was the youngest hand, barely 20, quick with a rope and slow with numbers. In his second month at the ranch, he made an expensive mistake, A miscalculation on a supply order that cost the operation real money at a time when real money was something they couldn't spare. Bert came to Aaron with the tally. June was in the kitchen, and the office window was open. She heard Aaron say, "Walk me through how it happened." She heard Will explain it, stumbling, clearly terrified, and Aaron listened without interrupting. Then, "All right, you're going to personally verify every order for the next 6 months. You're going to learn those numbers until you can't get them wrong. And you're going to check in with Bert at the end of every week, so we can catch it if it happens again." Will said in a very small voice, "You're not letting me go." "You made a mistake, not a habit. There's a difference." A pause. "Don't make it a habit." June stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall. She thought about the foremen she'd seen on neighboring farms growing up. The ones who cut a man loose for a single bad day and never thought twice about it. She thought about what it meant for a man with power to use it the way Aaron just had. She went back to her bread dough and said nothing about it that evening. But she stopped reinforcing the wall around herself quite as carefully after that. The night that changed things, really changed them in a way she couldn't walk back from, came in late October. A storm blew in fast off the Rockies, the way they did in that part of the territory, without the courtesy of warning. June had been visiting Francis on the far parcel and barely made it back to the main house before the sky opened. She arrived soaked through, changed, and assumed Aaron was managing the livestock. But when she came back through to the main room, she realized he hadn't come in. "Where is he?" she asked Bert, who was dripping in the doorway. "Barn," Bert said. "One of the horses. Took a bad fall in the south pasture before the storm hit. Boss has been with him since 3 o'clock. "How bad?" Bert's face answered before he did. June didn't deliberate. She took the lamp from the hook by the door and walked to the barn. She found Aaron on his knees in the straw beside a bay gelding. His first horse, she'd later learn, the one he'd brought with him when he took over the ranch 12 years ago. The horse was down, and even June could see it was serious. Aaron had one hand on the animal's neck, talking to him in a voice too low to hear the words. Only the sound of them. Steady, patient, the way you speak to something frightened and in pain. He didn't look up when June came in. She sat down on the other side of the horse and set the lamp where it would do the most good, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. She simply stayed. An hour passed, then another. Aaron never moved away, never let frustration enter his voice. He stayed present with the animal the way very few people knew how to be present with anything, completely without calculation, without accounting for what it cost. The horse didn't make it. It happened quietly, the way those things do, and when it was over, Aaron sat back on his heels and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor of the barn. He didn't speak. The silence in the barn was very complete. June stayed where she was. After a long while, she said, "I'm sorry." He exhaled. "He was with me since the beginning, before any of this was what it is now." "I know." She didn't know the details, but she understood the shape of what he was saying. "I should have got him in before the storm came. You couldn't have known it would move that fast." He was quiet. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Said it the way a person says something true when they've stopped managing how it sounds. "I hate losing things that trusted me." It was such a plain human thing to say. No performance in it, no management of how it landed. Just the honest truth of him, spoken to a woman who had been his wife for less than a month. June looked at him across the still form of the horse he had clearly loved and thought, there it is. There is who this man actually is. Not the feared rancher, not the silent force the district had built its stories around. Just a man who hated losing things and stayed with them until he couldn't anymore. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make tea." He got to his feet slowly. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not quite gratitude, but close to it, layered under something that looked like surprise. Like he hadn't expected company in a hard moment. Like he'd been alone in hard moments long enough that being accompanied in one felt unfamiliar. "June," he said. "Come inside, Aaron," she said again, and walked toward the barn door. He followed. She made tea, and he sat at the kitchen table, and neither of them said much of anything. But they sat there together for the better part of an hour, the lamp burning low between them, the storm pressing itself out against the windows. And June understood that something had passed between them in that barn that had nothing to do with debt or arrangements, or a contract she'd signed with her hands shaking. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she didn't push it away. When she finally said goodnight and went to her room, she lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about a man who had stayed all night beside a dying horse because he could not let something suffer alone. She thought about what kind of person does that. She thought about what kind of person she had assumed he was. She thought about how rarely those two things turned out to be the same. In town one Thursday afternoon, June overheard two women talking near the fabric bolts at the dry goods store. They hadn't seen her come in. Heard Tate got himself a wife. Radley girl, family's been struggling for years. Sold her off, then. That's what they're saying, poor thing. They say he's cold as iron. He helped the Parkers, said the second woman, quieter. When their barn burned last spring, he sent 4 of his men over for 2 weeks. Didn't charge a cent. That doesn't mean. And the Beaumont family, when the father broke his leg and couldn't bring in the harvest, Tate sent men to finish it, anonymously. Beaumont didn't find out who'd done it for 4 months. A pause. Well, said the first woman, deflated, he still doesn't come to the socials. Some people don't need an audience for their decency. June stood very still behind the shelving and stared at the middle distance. She thought about Will Decker and the careful mercy of a second chance. She thought about the horse in the barn. She thought about men sent to help strangers without expecting to be thanked or known. She bought her supplies and walked out, and on the ride back she thought about what it meant to have misjudged someone. Not just misjudged, but built an entire architecture of assumption and never once tested whether it was load-bearing. She confronted him about it that evening, directly, the way she handled most things. I heard something in town today, she said, setting his tea down. He looked up from the ledger he was working through. The Parker barn, the Beaumont harvest. He went back to the ledger. People in town talk too much. Aaron, he didn't answer. Why didn't you tell me? Because it doesn't need telling. He turned a page. It needed doing. It got done. June sat down across from him and looked at this man, her husband, still largely a stranger, and simultaneously someone she was beginning to understand at some level more fundamental than most people she'd known her whole life. Do you do this often? I have resources. Some people don't. That's arithmetic, not charity. That's not what most people with resources think. He looked up at that, met her eyes. And the expression on his face was the one she'd started to catalog. The one that appeared when she said something that got past the careful wall between him and most of the world. Maybe, he said, most people don't. She held his gaze. Were you always this way, or did something make you this way? A long pause, the lamp between them burned steady. My father wasn't, he said finally, like this. He closed the ledger. He had resources, too. He used them to own people's difficulty, liked that they couldn't say no to him. He looked at the closed cover. When I took over this ranch, I decided that whatever I built, it was going to be built differently. June said nothing. She understood that some things needed room around them after being said. After a moment. Your family's debt, he said. I don't hold it. I cleared it. I want to be clear about that. That's not leverage. It never was. Something loosened in June's chest. Something she hadn't fully known was tightened until it released. I know, she said quietly. I wasn't sure you did. I do now. I did before, actually. I just needed to hear it said. He nodded slowly, and the unnamed thing between them, the thing that had been sitting at the breakfast table and in the kitchen and in the quiet of shared evenings, grew a little more substantial, like something slowly finding its shape. 3 days later, she learned who Victor Lyle was. She heard it from Bet McLeod, who had heard it from her husband, who'd been in the hotel in McLeod on Wednesday evening. 2 of Lyle's men came in and talked in the particular way men talk when they intend to be overheard. Bet was not a woman who alarmed easily. She'd been born on the prairie and raised on its particular brand of hard truth. When she showed up at the main house with tight lines around her mouth and her hands not quite still, June knew before she opened her mouth that it was serious. Victor Lyle has been telling people in town that Aaron forced the marriage, Bet said without preamble, that your family was coerced, that you had no real choice. June felt her jaw tighten. That's not true. I know it isn't, but Lyle isn't interested in true. He's been saying it to anyone who'll listen, and some of them are. Bet pressed her lips together. He's also been asking questions at the land title office about the original survey of the Tate property from 15 years ago. Something cold moved through June. Why? Nobody's certain, but his man has been in twice this month. Word is he's looking for something specific. June stood in the kitchen and let the information settle, the way cold water settles, fast and complete and impossible to ignore. She thought about Aaron's account books she'd been organizing for weeks. She thought about the property documents she'd seen referenced in the older files. She thought about a man powerful enough and patient enough to look at Tate Ranch and decide he wanted it. And she thought, not while I'm standing here. After Bet left, June went to the office. She pulled every property document from the filing cabinet, sat down at Aaron's desk, and began to read. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she was going to know these records better than anyone by the time Aaron came in for dinner. When he found her surrounded by papers, he stopped completely. "Victor Lyle," she said before he could ask. "He's asking questions about your survey records." The stillness that came over Aaron's face was different from his usual quiet. This was the stillness of a man who hears a name he's been expecting and is now accounting for what comes next. "Tell me," June said. He came the rest of the way into the room, looked at the papers on the desk, looked at her, and the fact that he did that, sat down instead of taking the problem away to manage alone, the way she'd watched him manage everything alone, told her something had genuinely changed between them. Lyle wanted the ranch's west boundary, Aaron explained. Specifically, the river access that ran along it, the water rights that would make his southern parcels worth 4 times what they were now. He'd tried to buy it twice. Both times Aaron had said no, so now he was looking for another way in. "What am I looking for?" June asked. "Survey markers. Anything that shows an irregularity in the boundary description." He leaned forward. If there's any ambiguity in the legal description, Lyle could use it to file a competing claim. "Is there an irregularity?" Aaron met her eyes. "I don't know. I've never had reason to look that hard." June looked at the documents spread across the desk. Then she looked at her husband standing in lamplight with the full weight of something shapeless gathering on the horizon, and she felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not fear, not helplessness, anger. Clean, precise, purposeful anger. "Then we look," she said. He stayed at the desk. She moved the lamp closer, and there, in the office of Tate Ranch, with the autumn wind working at the shutters, and the weight of what was coming still formless on the horizon, they bent over the same documents and began reading together. Not quite husband and wife, and not strangers either. Something harder to name than either. Something that had been built quietly, day by day, out of shared breakfasts, and a horse that didn't survive a storm and ledgers balanced in lamplight, and a man who sent help to struggling families without ever signing his name. Something that, if neither of them quite had the language for it yet, was nonetheless already real. They worked past midnight. June found it at 11:30. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small thing, a discrepancy between the original 1871 survey and an amended filing from 1879. A single creek marker described differently in each document. In the original, the western boundary ran from the Cottonwood Post at Willow Creek's North Fork. In the 1879 amendment, it referenced the South Fork. 2 words, 8 years apart. Between those 2 forks, depending on which document a judge chose to honor, was a strip of land roughly 80 yards wide running the full length of the western boundary, containing the river access Lyle wanted. She set her finger on the discrepancy. Aaron leaned forward and read it, then read it again. "He knows," Aaron said, "not a question." "He's known for a while, I'd guess." June looked at the 1879 document more closely. The handwriting on the amendment was not the same as the original survey. Aaron, who filed the 1879 amendment. He took the paper from her, read the name at the bottom, and went very still. "Harold Steer," he said quietly. "He was the county registrar that year, retired the year after." He set the paper down. "Lyle's wife is a Steer." The room felt colder. "This was set up before Lyle even knew he'd want this land," June said. "His family has been planting leverage points across this district for a generation." Aaron stood, put his hands on the back of the chair. "He's been waiting for the right moment to use it. He's decided that moment is now." June looked at the documents on the desk. Then she looked at her husband, standing in lamplight, with the full weight of a 15-year-old trap, closing around everything he'd spent his life building. And something moved through her that she hadn't expected. Not fear, anger, clean, precise, purposeful. "We need a lawyer," she said. "First thing tomorrow." He watched her hands moving over the papers, organizing them into careful order. "June." "What?" "You said we." She looked up and met his eyes. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without explanation. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Then he reached across and took half the documents to organize alongside her. The lawyer's name was Charles Garvey, and he operated out of a narrow office above the hardware store in Macleod. He was 62 years old, had practiced in the district for 30 years, and had the quality of a man who had heard every variety of trouble and remained unimpressed by it. June liked him immediately. He read both survey documents 3 times. Then he set them down, removed his glasses, and said, "Well, well." The controlling question was whether the original survey could establish the true boundary. If the 1879 amendment was fraudulent, they had a strong case. If Lyle had already filed a claim, they needed to move fast. He had. A claim had been registered at the title office 4 days ago. At the bottom of Aaron's oldest filing box, the one they'd found on their second night of searching, June had found a letter. The paper was brittle at the creases. It was from the original county surveyor to Aaron's father, dated 1879, documenting a conversation in which the county registrar Harold Steer had asked him to alter the boundary description in the Tate property amendment. The surveyor had refused. He had written to Aaron's father to warn him, naming an unnamed party with significant land interests to the south. Lyle's father, who had started building the leverage his son had picked up and carried forward. Aaron's father had never told him. When this was read into the record at the hearing, Lyle's lawyers objected twice. The judge overruled them both times. The hardest part in the weeks before had not been the legal preparation. It had been the town. Lyle's version of the story had spread the way bad stories always spread, faster than truth, sticking to people in ways that were difficult to dislodge. Conversations that stopped when June walked into the dry goods store. A look from the postmaster's wife that lasted half a second too long. The story Lyle was circulating was precise and poisonous. June Radley had been sold by her family to settle a debt. Aaron Tate had used financial coercion to force the marriage. The whole arrangement was exploitation dressed as necessity. The cruelest part was how close to the surface of truth it sat. June walked through town with her spine straight and her face even. She did not defend herself to people who had already decided, because she had learned young that defending yourself to a closed mind is a waste of breath that could be used better elsewhere. But it cost her. She didn't tell Aaron how much. She was wrong to think she was hiding it. One evening she came back from town to find him in the kitchen, unusual, before dinner. He was standing at the counter with his arms folded, and when she came through the door, he looked at her with an expression that cut straight through the face she'd been wearing all afternoon. "Bert was in town today," he said. "He told me what happened at the mercantile." June set her basket on the table. "It's fine." "It's not fine." She looked at him. "Mrs. Dunning asked me, in front of 4 other women, whether I'd signed the marriage document myself or whether my father had signed it for me." She paused. She said it like she was doing me a kindness, like she was giving me an opportunity to admit I was a victim. Aaron's jaw went hard. "I told her I signed it myself, with my own hand, after a conversation with my husband in which he told me plainly I could refuse." June met his eyes. "I told her the debt was cleared because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement was honest, and anyone who wanted to characterize it otherwise was welcome to speak to me directly instead of building stories in the back corners of stores." A beat of silence. 4 other women heard that, he said. 5. The milliner came in partway through. Something moved through Aaron's expression, completely. The way things moved through him, without announcement but entirely. "I should have," he started. "Don't," she said firmly, but not unkindly. "Don't tell me you should have protected me from it. I handled it." "I know you handled it." He looked at her steadily. "That doesn't mean you should have had to handle it alone." The words landed differently than she expected. She stood in the kitchen and felt them settle, felt the specific weight of being told plainly, without performance, that someone wanted to stand beside her in the hard things. Not because she couldn't manage them, but because she shouldn't have to manage them alone. She thought about what she'd understood in the barn the night the horse died. Nobody has ever taken care of this man. He had spent his entire adult life being the person who managed everything for everyone, and it had never occurred to anyone to ask if he needed looking after too. And now she understood the mirror of it. She had spent her entire life being the person who handled things, who held herself together so well that people forgot to ask if she needed holding too. "I know," she said quietly. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, close in a way that was chosen rather than incidental. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the gesture so careful it almost wasn't there. "2 more weeks," he said. "Then it's done." She looked up at him. "And if the judge doesn't rule our way?" "He will, but if he doesn't, we appeal. And we keep appealing, and Lyle spends every dollar he was planning to make off that water access on lawyers, and so do we, and eventually one of us runs out." He paused. "It won't be us." She believed him. Not because she had to, not because the alternative was too frightening, but because she'd been watching this man for 2 months and understood that when Aaron Tate said something plainly and without decoration, he meant it in the deepest possible way. 4 days before the hearing, Lyle made his last move. Through the bank, he purchased an old promissory note Aaron's father had taken out years prior, largely repaid, the remaining balance modest, and called it due immediately on a buried technicality. The amount wasn't catastrophic. The timing was. 1 week before a court hearing, with every resource already stretched, and the psychological pressure at its highest. June rode out to find Aaron at the east fence line and handed him the message without preamble. He read it. His face went still. "Manageable," June said before he could speak. Both Bert and Aaron looked at her. "The amount is manageable. We have the reserves from the grain contract I renegotiated in September. It wipes most of that out, but we can cover it and still function." She looked at Aaron. "I checked the account books this morning." Aaron looked at the message in his hand. Then at her. Something moved through him. Not defeat, which was what Lyle had been hoping for, but something harder and more deliberate. "He wants us rattled going into that courtroom," Aaron said. "I know what he wants." June held his gaze. "We're not going to give it to him." She sorted the bank payment that afternoon. While she was in town, she also visited the Parker family and the Beaumonts. She asked them if they would come to the hearing and speak to who Aaron Tate actually was. The Parkers said yes before she finished asking. Mrs. Parker, a woman of 50 with the particular steadiness of someone who has been helped in a genuine moment of need, looked at June across her kitchen table and said, "We've been waiting for someone to ask." The Beaumonts were the same. She rode back to the ranch with 3 committed witnesses and the bank sorted, and she felt something she recognized from a long time ago. From before the debt, before the dry seasons, before the day her father had called her name from the front room in that flat, careful voice. She felt useful, not in the grinding way of the past 2 years, but the real way, the purposeful way. The way of a person who has found the place where their particular capacities meet something that genuinely needs them. When she got back to the ranch, Aaron was waiting on the porch. He saw her face. How many? 3 families, possibly 4. He stepped off the porch and took her horse's bridle as she dismounted. They were standing close, that chosen closeness that had slowly become natural between them. "June," he said. "Don't thank me. It's not done yet." He shook his head slowly. "I wasn't going to thank you." He looked at her with the steady quality she'd first read as coldness, and now understood as its opposite, as the careful attention of a man who meant everything he noticed. "I was going to say I don't know what I did to deserve this." "Deserve what?" "You," he said, simply, like the word was accurate and didn't need anything added to it. She looked at him in the late afternoon light. This man who had blown into her life like a cold front off the Rockies and turned out to be the warmest thing in it. "You showed up," she said. "That's what you did. You showed up and you were honest, and you didn't pretend to be something easier than you are." She paused. "That's not nothing, Aaron. For most people, that's everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand and held it, not as a precursor to anything, Just held it the way you hold something you're not ready to put down. She let him. The morning of the hearing, McLeod was cold and bright, and the courthouse steps were more crowded than June had anticipated. The Parkers were there, the Beaumonts, the Hendersons, all three of them. Bet McLeod's husband, whom June had never met, shook Aaron's hand with the directness of someone who had decided where he stood. Frances arrived with the baby on her hip and her chin up. And Will Decker was there, standing near the back in a clean shirt slightly too large for him, hat in his hands. He'd come on his own. Nobody had asked him. Aaron saw him and stopped walking. Will looked at the ground. Figured you might need people to speak to what kind of man you are, Will said. I got something to say on that subject, if it helps. Aaron was quiet for a moment. It helps, he said. Garvey was brilliant in that courtroom. Methodical, precise, each piece of evidence placed with the care of a man constructing something that cannot be shaken. The original 1871 survey, the 1879 amendment, the handwriting discrepancy, the Steer family connection, and then, with deliberate weight, the letter, the old surveyor's warning to Aaron's father, documenting the attempted interference with the boundary filing, naming the unnamed party with significant land interests to the south. Lyle's lawyers objected to the letter twice. The judge overruled them both times. Then Garvey called the character witnesses. Mrs. Parker told the court about the barn. Her voice was steady, and she looked at the judge the whole time she spoke, not at Lyle, not at Aaron, as though she wanted to make certain the judge received it directly. Mr. Beaumont described the harvest. The Hendersons described the winter Aaron's men had spent 2 days pulling their cattle out of a flooded creek, a story June hadn't heard before, and she felt Aaron go very still beside her. Will Decker, in the back, described being given a second chance when no other employer in the district would have granted one. Then Garvey called June. She walked to the front of the room with her shoulders back and her hands still, sat down, looked at the judge, and waited. Garvey asked her about the marriage. She told the truth, all of it, without softening any of the parts that were hard. The debt, her family's situation, the conversation at her parents' kitchen table, where Aaron had told her plainly she could refuse. She told the court exactly what he had said, that it was a business arrangement, that she would have her own room, that it only worked if she agreed freely. Lyle's lawyer rose for cross-examination. He was smooth and indirect in the way of men who had learned that direct attacks on women in courtrooms tend to go badly. Mrs. Tate, he said pleasantly, wouldn't you say you felt considerable pressure to agree given your family's circumstances? I felt considerable pressure from my family's circumstances, June said, not from Aaron Tate. But the offer itself. Without the offer, we would have found another way. She looked at the lawyer steadily. I agreed to this marriage because after speaking with my husband, I determined he was an honest man making an honest offer. I have not found any evidence since that I was wrong. She paused one beat. I have found considerable evidence that I was right. The lawyer tried 2 more approaches. She answered both with the same quality, not aggressive, not defensive, simply accurate. He sat down. When she returned to her seat, Aaron's hand found hers under the table and stayed there. The judge called a recess. It lasted 40 minutes, which Garvey said was a good sign, and which felt to June like a different order of time entirely. She sat in the hallway with Aaron beside her, and the ranch families ranged around them in the particular solidarity of people who have chosen a side and committed to it. Will Decker sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hat in his hands. Nobody talked much. At one point, Aaron said very quietly, "Whatever he rules, we told the truth. Every person in that courtroom knows it." She looked at him. That has to count for something. He looked at their joined hands. I never meant for you to stay, he said. When I made that arrangement, I told myself it was practical, that you'd manage the house and I'd clear your family's debt and it would be a fair exchange. He paused. I didn't expect you to be. I didn't plan for you. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. That's why I did. He lifted his eyes to hers. Stay, she said clearly. That's why I stayed, not because of the debt or the contract or because I had nowhere else to go. She held his gaze without flinching. Because you're the most honest person I've ever met, and you show up for things, and you don't quit on anything that's worth not quitting on. That's why. Aaron Tate, who had never in June's experience been without composure when he needed it, said nothing. He just looked at her, with something in his face so unguarded and so complete that she had to look away first, because it felt like looking directly at something too bright. She looked at the courthouse door. He held her hand. They waited. The judge ruled in 43 minutes. The 1879 amendment was found to be procedurally irregular based on the documented testimony of the original surveyor, corroborated by handwriting analysis. The original 1871 boundary description was reinstated as the controlling legal document. Lyle's claim was dismissed. The river access, the west boundary, all of it confirmed as Tate property. What happened afterward was quiet. Bert shaking Aaron's hand with both of his. Mrs. Parker hugging June with the fierceness of a woman who means a hug entirely. Will Decker in the back pressing his lips together and looking at the ceiling for a moment before he composed himself. Garvey leaned in and said to both of them together, "The pattern of interference will likely be referred to the territorial attorney. The Steer family connection, the fraudulent amendment. This doesn't end here. You may have to testify again." "We'll be there," June said. Aaron looked at her. "We'll be there," he agreed. The drive home was different from every drive they had taken before. The urgency was gone, the weight they'd been carrying, the legal threat, the documents, the 2 weeks of preparation that had consumed every available hour, was gone. What remained in its absence was something lighter and more permanent. They drove in silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation between them now. Then Aaron said, "The south fence line is going to need work before the ground freezes." June looked at the road ahead. "I know, I put it in the supply order already." He was quiet, then he laughed. She'd heard him laugh before. Rarely, briefly, the contained version. This was different. It came from somewhere deeper, and it lasted longer, and it sounded like a man who has set down something he'd been carrying for years, and is only now realizing how long he'd had hold of it. She felt it move through her like prairie light breaking through after a long overcast. She started laughing too, not about anything specific, just the accumulated relief of it, the release of two people who had been holding themselves tightly for a very long time, letting go at the same moment, on the same road, under the same wide Alberta sky. They drove the rest of the way home like that. Months later, Tate Ranch was different. Not in the way that looked different from the outside. The cattle were the same cattle. The fence lines were the same fence lines, some of them newly repaired. The supply orders went out on schedule. Bert still delivered bad news with the consistency of a man who had made it a professional practice. Will Decker's numbers were finally impeccable. But the ranch was not silent anymore. It hadn't been silent for a long time, actually, not since a young woman had arrived with a trunk she carried herself, and an arrangement she'd agreed to with clear eyes, and had proceeded from the very first morning to be exactly who she was. On a morning in early spring, June walked the south pasture beside Aaron. The new fence posts were up. The grass was coming back after a long winter. She could hear Will singing something incorrectly to himself near the barn, and the sound of it made her smile. Aaron glanced at her. "What?" "Nothing," she shook her head. "Just this." He understood. She could tell he understood without needing it explained, which was one of the things about Aaron Tate she had stopped being surprised by and started being simply grateful for. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "You were never part of the arrangement," he said quietly, the way he said the things he meant most. "I want you to know that. Whatever I told myself at the beginning about practicality, I was wrong. You were never a transaction. You were never part of what I was trying to solve." He looked at her. "You became something I didn't know I was missing." June looked at this man, who had waited up when she was late back from town, who had asked her opinion on the grain contracts before signing them, who had never once in 6 months of marriage made her feel like anything less than a full person with full standing in her own life. "I know," she said softly. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood in the spring morning of the south pasture, with the Rockies pale on the western horizon, and the foothills wind moving through everything around them. And June thought about a young woman who had pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop the trembling, and said "all right" in a voice that didn't shake. She thought about what that moment had become instead. Not survival, not an arrangement, not a practical solution to an impossible situation. A life, a real, particular, chosen life built from nothing in a place she hadn't planned to be, beside a man she hadn't planned to love. She had been afraid. She had been angry. She had been so certain that circumstances had taken everything from her. And instead, on the other side of fear, on the other side of anger, on the other side of every hard morning and every careful dinner and every moment she had refused to stop being herself, she had found something no arrangement could have guaranteed and no debt could have purchased. She had found someone worth choosing. And she had been brave enough, just barely, just enough, to keep choosing him one honest day at a time. That was not luck. That was not survival. That was love built the only way it lasts.